All right, friends. Well, Joshua Porter. I mean, is Josh okay? Can I call you Josh?
Yeah,
Is that fine? Okay.
please.
I mean, I had you on. It's funny. I was thinking about this actually before I brought you into the room. I had you on. It had to be close to 3 years ago because you wrote a book, Death to Deconstruction, and I was pretty new with New Evangelicals, and I was on the pro deconstruction warpath, and I'm like, who's this guy? I'm like, oh my God, it's the dude from Showbread. That's like a deep cut from my evangelical hardcore upbringing. I mean, Mouth Like a Magazine is like one of my favorite and I think most unique music videos I've ever seen. I saw you guys at a venue or at a festival called Purple Door, and I was like, I gotta have this guy on because I would think if anyone would have a similar trajectory as I would, it'd be me. I also read the entire book, and I did enjoy a lot of it, and there were some parts that I disagreed with. So you came on, we had a great conversation, and now you're back with another book. It's called How to Die: Chaos, Mortality, and the Scandal of Christian Discipleship. It came out in August of this year. And I gotta say, I'm excited to talk to you because I'm not sure how you feel, but I very much see myself as like a different person than I was even 3 years ago on the podcast. I wouldn't say that a lot of my views have like shifted radically, but they've evolved. And I don't know, I'm just kind of curious to have this version of Tim talk to this version of Josh because we have a recording of it from 3 years ago. So good to be with you.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Absolutely. So, I mean, why don't you go ahead and give the audience, because a lot of folks are new here since you've been on, just a brief background of yourself and kind of the premise for the book. And I'm going to start asking some questions.
Great. Well, I mean, you gave me a really wonderful biography back there. Guy from a band. Saw you at Purple Door.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I grew up in kind of the maybe the satanic panic era of the 80s and 90s in rural Georgia, so southeast Georgia, and a really conservative, really fundamentalist kind of environment. There were some good aspects of my kind of Christian culture upbringing, and there were some aspects that were not so great.
Yeah.
And then I, discovered punk rock music and yada, 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 started a band and traveled around the world for, I don't know, 15, 16 years or something like that. And during that time, like many people raised in a Christian environment, was sort of refining or deconstructing and then rebuilding or figuring out what I thought about the world. It's not that unique a story, but I guess maybe the part of it that's a little more unique is that I eventually settled in the Pacific Northwest in the Portland metro area, and became a pastor of a small neighborhood church out here. And I do less music these days and now do more writing and hanging out with a family up here in Vancouver, Washington.
Well, I was trying to find a picture. Let's see if I can even do this. It's been a little while. If I can grab this shot, I can, I think. Let me bring you into this shot with me. I was trying to find a picture of your band. This one's kind of small, but that's you guys right there. And that's you in the middle, right? The long, like, black emo hair. I don't know if you would call it makeup, but your eyes like were done up, And I remember seeing the video and seeing you guys. I'm like, who is this edgy, like breaking the boundary, band? And they're Christian, so they don't say bad words in their music, But yeah, you have had a very interesting trajectory. And I think part of you, from what I can tell, enjoys that side of it. Like, hey, like, you really can't pin me down, right? Like somewhere I'm gonna break your brain regarding either how I look or how I talk or what I believe. They're never gonna fully mesh together, right? Because I think a lot of people who grew up, and I grew up similar to you as well, have kind of either gone one of two ways, broadly speaking. They've either gone, we can say progressive Christian in some way, shape, or form, which is certainly where I have went, or they've just walked out or run out of the house of Christian thought entirely for all kinds of reasons, right? They were really hurt, real abuse. The theology wasn't adding up. They just lost the belief. Maybe they found a different house to park in. But you are someone, it seems like, and tell me if I'm wrong, but you are still very much Christian, and I would argue you would use the term like Orthodox Christian. So maybe on some of the issues that might be more around culture and how we see certain things, we would have some disagreements there. But we also would agree on like Christian nationalism being anathema and being incredibly dangerous. Is that a fair? I don't want to misrepresent you. I'm just kind of curious if you think that's accurate.
No, that's completely accurate. Yeah.
Okay. So talk to me about this book. I mean, I find it compelling because you and I share this thought of like, well, what does being faithful to Jesus look like in America, right? I mean, there's a great book by Matthew Bates, and he argues that the word faith is better translated allegiance. What does radical allegiance to the way of Jesus look like? And I really am asking myself that question every day, especially as we're seeing the rise of Christian nationalism really in our government and just seeing things that seem so antichrist. So is that what your book is about? Like, kind of give me the premise and why you decided to write How to Die.
Well, I mean, I spent many years of the whole punk rock music thing very concerned about what we probably would have called still, or we would have used evangelicalism a different way some 15 years ago. You know what I mean? And hence the title of your show. And
Right.
so at the time, before it was like widely considered profane or exclusively a political term, evangelicalism as like a junk drawer term for sort of mainline modern Protestant Christianity and in the West and in America. And I spent a lot of those late kind of showbread years with that as my, I guess, major point of concern, but also just level of significant theological interest. And so all of the late like showbread work, I had a friend joke to me at near the end of Showbread's tenure. It's like, man, you guys are like Rage Against the Machine now. All you sing about is the same thing over, and that's still very much a part of my thinking and teaching and my theological kind of proclivities, I guess. But over the last few years, being immersed in, I guess, what will probably be called something like the new spiritual formation movement, which is a school of thought that's like emphasizing spiritual practice as a way to, I guess, the mind of Christ. And so more of like rooted in mystic Christianity and the Desert Fathers, and then later on through the thinking of philosophers and theologians like Dallas Willard. This has been something that has not in any way like I'm an expert in or that but that has been a point of significant interest for me for the past, I guess, like maybe 8 or 9 years. And out of that, and then having conversations around deconstruction as a pastor and someone who's been through, their own period of significant deconstruction, and then writing that whole book and like, blah, 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 blah. I came to a place where the idea of writing Christian nonfiction is only interesting to me if I could do something very unconventional with it. Because there's a lot of writers and thinkers much more intelligent than I am, with way more experience than I have, that are writing great books on every conceivable topic.
Yeah.
And so I feel as if the only thing that I have to offer is my, I guess, unique approach to those things. And so at some point, I became interested in writing a generic book on discipleship, because out of all those conversations with different kinds of people across all kinds of different Christian traditions about deconstruction, the question that sort of undergirded a lot of those conversations, or the outcome of those conversations, was like, what does it even mean to be a Christian? Not even in the deeply nuanced sense, but in the big, broad sense. What does it mean to be a Christian? And I was like, oh, that's an interesting book. And I actually don't know that I have that book. I can give someone a stack of books with lots of different perspectives that you can cobble together. But I liked the idea of there being like a manual, a 1-volume manual that can't say everything, but it could cover big, broad strokes in some kind of interesting way. And I started trying to do that, like, sermon style, and it was really boring, like essay style, and it was boring me to death. So I'm sure it would have bored the reader to death. And eventually, like, I had this idea that's like, oh, well, what if it was like the kind of book that someone like found buried at a monastery, that was like a journal that, like no one knew where it came from. It was like something really different than your ordinary essay style. I'm going to make these arguments to get to this point kind of thing. So the book has all this kind of like, like fiction and retelling of parables and poetry and creeds and things like that. It still is intended to be like a short style 1-volume manual on Christianity. So it does Bible, it does Sermon on the Mount, and it does some of the practical stuff, but in a way that hopefully is unexpected or interesting.
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised you would do it that way because I read your first book and I've seen your other work. I've seen your website, and it seems like you enjoy. I think that you're someone who finds art being such a compelling medium to tell things in unique ways. So I'm not surprised that writing essays and sermons were boring you to death, and that you went this route. Even the book cover is like, what am I looking at? It has a really just like unique vibe, which again I really appreciate as an artist myself, as a musician. So, I mean, you're asking a great question that just speaking truthfully to the audience and to you, like I wrestle with myself. I find myself asking the question a lot of, what does this moment require of me as a follower of Jesus, especially given everything that is happening in our cultural moment. Certainly, we're not the only generation, right, of humans to have things happening that are just like out of this world. But I would also argue that in my lifetime, probably in yours as well, that what's happening does feel very unprecedented. And it is discouraging, I think, to say the least, to see the tradition that maybe we can say introduce us to Jesus seem to abandon some of the most basic teachings of the person they're claiming to follow and embrace cruelty in so many different ways, and also things that just aren't true. And I know there's a lot of common agreement with many folks who wouldn't share all of my political or theological persuasions, but then we start to kind of diverge over, well, what does this moment require of us? So I want to start with you before I kind of give my space, because this is an interview, not a monologue. But how do you think about that idea of like, what does the moment require of Christians right now in 2025, when, especially in the American context, what we're watching is I don't know, I would almost argue like a bastardized empire version of Christianity do so much harm to our neighbors?
Well, man, geez, what a complicated question. I mean, honestly, the way, and I'm sure you would agree, the way that I would have answered this 15 years ago is different from the way I'd answer it 3 years ago.
Totally.
And
totally.
I'm at the mercy of my own narrow experience, so I don't presume to speak authoritatively on, that said, I think that I'm also a product of my environment. And one of the reasons that I think that I became so preoccupied with an answer to the, scourge of Christian nationalism was because of my upbringing. I was raised in a deeply militaristic, nationalistic, and it wasn't out of any kind of like profound, I just started to notice inconsistencies with what I was being taught in the environment of the church and the world around me. The story of so many people of, ours and similar generations, which led me to asking certain questions and coming to certain conclusions. And that I'm grateful that was part of my theological coming of age, because it exposed me to a world of, I guess, theologians and traditions to which I had not been privy, and developed my thinking around what does it mean for a Christian to understand and relate to the state, and how does a Christian engage or withdraw from the affairs of the state, and not just now, but throughout church history. And now for the last, I guess almost 15 years, I've lived in Portland and then in the Portland metro area, so I've gone from like one of the most conservative environments in the United States, rural Georgia, to one of the most progressive environments. And I'm using these terms loosely, but generically, in the United States.
Sure.
And so, I, as someone who's a product of their environment, my thinking naively as a teenager and a young adult was that the environment of the rural Southeast was reflective of the entire, Western world, let alone, you know what I mean? Yeah, and in some ways, the world is a Southern place, if that makes sense. The kind of, I guess, backward thinking that is part and parcel of the conservative fundamentalist environment you can find all across any different cultural, But now, as someone who's been a part of deeply progressive culture for the last 15 years, and participating in church environments in the Pacific Northwest, to to say that the two are different is like the understatement of the century. You know what I mean? And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that there are no nationalistic churches in the Pacific Northwest, or that there are there's no political idolatry. Of course there is. It's everywhere. But, I've worked for and with churches and been part of participating in churches in the Pacific Northwest the last 15 years. And in some ways, it's almost been like a reversal of my upbringing to see so many different churches, small churches, huge churches that are deeply concerned with all the things that bother me, or that, and I'm not just meaning that I'm talking into an echo chamber, but that have the same kind of deep-seated revulsion towards militarism and Christian nationalism, and that are actively participating in justice causes in the city and around the world. And so, and I guess maybe what I'm getting at is that like that dichotomy was helpful in bringing me back into the environment of the church, because in all my adolescent wisdom, I think that I had concluded what my experience is indicative of church with a capital C,
Yeah.
as opposed to people there. Of course, people suck everywhere.
Yep.
Anytime people gather up, there's going to be some level of corruption. And so I think that I've become preoccupied over the last, decade, and certainly the last 5 years, with a more narrow view of my own microcosm in the world. And that's not to say that like I have no concern for anything beyond my immediate purview, but I'm trying to figure out what it means for me to be an active member of what we might describe as the body of Christ,
Yeah.
and to belong to, or to be someone who is a person of justice and peace and reconciliation, a person who rejects, nationalism, militarism, violence, in my own narrow scope of the world, and to step into the calling that I have. I think there was a time and place when during which it was my calling to speak with, I guess, I hate to use the word like platform, but I actually went from city to city to city on a stage with a microphone and said
a literal
things.
Platform,
Yeah, a literal platform in this case. And
Yeah.
I think that was, like the calling over my life, if you like, at that time. And I think that I, as much as I knew how at the time, used that to say things that I think God gave me to say in such a way, and I'm trying to do that now with a more narrow, or a smaller megaphone. I care for a small church and a community of people, and I live in a city that is in the Portland metro area, but it's small by comparison, and there are concerns in my area. I have a family. It's just like got kids and everything.
Yep,
so I'm trying to learn what it means to not become an insular person, not become a person that's folded in on themselves with no perspective beyond me, but also a person who's realistically concerned with the things within my responsibility, if that makes sense. I know that's a long, rambly way of answering your question, but I guess it's also a way of me saying like I'm also trying to figure that out.
Typical pastor, just ranting around. No,
that's what we do for a living.
Yeah, for real. Same. I podcast for a living. You talk about rants. That makes a lot of sense. That's helpful. And I get this question a lot too. Tim, what can I do? How do we change things? And I say, look, do what you can. Get involved in your local communities. Volunteer more. Maybe run for school board. Raise empathetic kids who want to love their neighbor well. Like those are things that you can control. Vote how you need to vote. But I often do wonder myself, like how much of our brains are designed to take in a fire hose of bad news in places that we just can't control. And I don't say that as a way to minimize the real suffering that's happening in the world that this podcast and TNE and all of our networks cover. There's a real obligation, I think, as Christians to be aware of injustices, again, especially ones committed in the empire that we are occupying. But also, like, it takes a toll on you to see things all the time that you just cannot change directly, and it just sits with you, and it's I think painful, and I'm not sure if it's always healthy just to kind of re-traumatize ourselves, because this metal brick in our hand can get us information about anything momentarily from anywhere in the world or beyond, So I think that there's definitely an angle there. I'm wondering for you, when you think about, your subtitle is chaos, mortality, and the scandal of Christian discipleship. And I think that word or that phrase, Christian discipleship, dies the death of 1,000 qualifications, right? Depending on your tradition and how you see it. So I'm kind of curious for you how you think about that, phrase, because to be frank with you, Josh, I don't want to abandon Christian language just because evangelicalism gave it to me, and I'm like, oh, evangelicalism bad. So I don't want to like not use phrases like Christian discipleship or say I'm a follower of Jesus, because I am. Like, I want to be discipled by Christ. But I think that one of the problems I'm realizing is that, and I would love your thoughts on this, tying it back into that question, I realized that my evangelical tradition was actually deeply untethered from Orthodox Christianity, if that makes sense. Like, a lot of I didn't know about the church calendar until like 5 years ago, as embarrassing as it is to say. I have found that really this walk down the aisle, pray the prayer, salvation is super cheap. I think Bonhoeffer would call it cheap grace, and really requires nothing of us. And I think that how I was taught to understand the Bible was just factually incorrect and really unhelpful long term. And I think a lot of the views that I was taught were like historic aren't that historic. Now, that's not always a bad thing. But I'm just kind of realizing how untethered I really am to some kind of rich Christian tradition that has hundreds or thousands of years of theologians, arguing about things and systems and institutions that have been built. Have you thought about that as well, as you've kind of rethought and maybe found the mystic tradition helpful? Like, have you kind of realized that as well? Like, oh, actually, I wasn't tied to really anything besides this American evangelicalism, which really isn't rooted in much other than capitalism and empire, etc.
Oh, 100%. I mean, if I kind of unpacked the depth of my Christian upbringing, and it honestly took me many, many years to come to a place where I could admit to myself and other people that there were actually some beautiful things about my upbringing and the community of my upbringing. And some, of course, tragically flawed, deeply broken things. And I think that in my naivety, especially as a younger person, I assumed that one thing canceled the other thing out, and that because there were people in my upbringing who displayed these qualities or embraced these qualities that I would now describe as sinful or even grotesque, that sort of precluded any good contribution that they could have ever made in my life. And eventually I was challenged, I believe, by the Spirit of God on those things to realize, like, oh, people are deeply complex, and some people who hurt me in some ways also contributed to my spiritual formation in meaningful ways. I mean, any parent obviously realizes this, that you hurt your children, and that you also, on your best day, you form them for the better. It's the inevitability of the human condition. So yeah, of course, my upbringing, I was like Southern Baptist, and I think that the things that I took from my theological upbringing was a paradigm for the personal love of God. I was given a paradigm of God as a relational, personal God, because we use all that language that's not so great about Jesus Christ as personal Lord. Ask him into your heart as your personal Lord and Savior.
Right.
But I was given a paradigm of God as personal. And then beyond that, rampantly biblically illiterate. And this sounds so arrogant, like I know so much better. I just mean that I was too. And, this was a view, these were views that I embraced and took for granted, and in the same way that my elders embraced and took for granted. So yeah, of course you come to a place where the language that you've been given is not doesn't just feel stagnant, it feels faulty. You know what I mean? The way that exactly what you're describing, where you've got these sort of catchphrases and monikers, or even a glossary of Christianese that is no longer helpful, and it's no longer reflective of what you actually think and believe about the scriptures, about God. And so, when I first came back into the church world of the church, and not like as someone who worked there, just as someone participating in the local church, there was a long period of unlearning certain terminologies and turns of the phrase. But and then eventually, I think, everything's so cyclical. Depending on which tradition you're reading and in which thing you've immersed yourself, you come back to certain phrases that made you sick 10 years ago, and now you can through a different angle, through a different lens, you've been given a new perspective on exactly what that means and why.
Yeah.
But all that said, like I should point out that I'm an aesthetics first kind of person when it comes to writing. So to me, and maybe not maybe, definitely to a fault, hence, the title of my book before this one.
Yes.
I
It got
liked
me.
the,
It's like,
I
who's
remember
this man writing this book?
and that's as we talked about, that's interesting to me. That's an interesting, I like titles that do that. I like phrases that do that.
Same.
And so I like,
yeah, me too.
It's less important to me if it's like, exactly communicatively perfect than it is aesthetically interesting. Like hopefully not at the compromise of like actual integrity or anything like that. But
Sure. Yeah, no, that's helpful. All right, let's get into this. Christian discipleship. I mean, you're a pastor, you pastor a small church. You said you kind of come, I'm not going to say full circle, you just evolved, from where you were to back then to where you are now. I think that you would say more firmly rooted in the way of Jesus. What does that look like for you? And like, how do you talk about it in the book? I think a lot of people want that, but we're not really sure maybe like what that means, right? I mean, I'll put it this way. Just to be frank, I think that some people will hear, how to die, chaos, mortality, and the scandal of Christian discipleship. And I think our queer audience will hear that and go, oh, so I have to die to my sexual orientation and like have to stay celibate in order to be a good Christian. And so this feels to me very like, non-affirming theology. Other people might hear this and be like, that is hardcore. I want to die to self. Like I'm all in, right? So I give that perspective of like, depending on who you're talking to, it can mean very different things. So how do you like talk about it in the book, this idea of Christian discipleship? I'm just so curious.
Well, it started with, the book opens with an epigraph from Bonhoeffer. It's the famous, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die, as the prerequisite to discipleship. And obviously Bonhoeffer's paraphrasing Jesus as if anyone wants to follow me, they have to take up their cross. And at least in one of the Gospels, daily, you have to take up their cross daily and follow me. Obviously, that take up the cross language, going back to the thing we were just talking about, has sort of been robbed of some of its subversiveness.
Yeah, right.
So I like Bonhoeffer's paraphrase because it's so blunt. So when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And so to me, again, an aesthetics thing, and in provocative titles, I just liked the idea of three big, simple words. And as the prerequisite to discipleship in Jesus's paradigm, like the death to self thing, if you like the Christian cultural language, or in Bonhoeffer's, come and die, take up your cross, however you want to put it, and then follow me. If you're going to do what I attempt to do in the book, which is the meta narrative of the whole Bible, and then the canon within the canon, the Sermon on the Mount, and then some of the practices of Jesus, then the prerequisite to any of that is the presumption that it would be a costly thing to do to take up the cross or to die to self. So obviously, I mean, and I like that about, and at the risk of sounding insensitive, I don't mean it to say like, oh, I like it if it ticks people off. That would have been like me 20 years ago. Like I like being a provocateur just for the sake of being a provocateur. Yeah. I don't know that you ever completely lose that. I do enjoy provocative art, but I enjoy it as like someone who, appreciates art. I like art that provokes me. And I write the book that I want to read. I write the song I want to hear. And then I hope or entrust it to God to do something meaningful in someone's life if he so chooses. So, I liked that idea of a manual on disciple. And of course, the publisher, just like with Death to Deconstruction, they were like, is there anything else that we could call this thing? Like, is there some way to clarify or soften the language? One of the pitches was like, what if it's called How to Die to Self? And I'm like, that's such a Christian colloquialism.
Boring. Who are you, Zondervan? What is this?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. You and I are kind of cut from the same cloth in that way, because anyone who listens to my show now who knows me from back in my Facebook rant days about the church, even when I was still very conservative, I always talked in ways that like was provocative to people. They always thought I was so over the top and so extreme. And it's not that I wanted to provoke for the sake of provoking, but I was like, guys, like I'm saying it this way to get your attention, to point you to something that I think is happening that's deeper. And so that's why I think I really wanted to get you on the podcast even a few years ago, because as much as I hated your title, I secretly loved it because it got me. I'm like, oh, like I'm kind of into this though. I mean, I'm going to read the book first, but I might disagree with the idea, but I can't fault the guy for writing a title that is like provocative, that makes you want to read more about this person's story and journey. And so I'm with you on that, you know, and I even think that maybe it's our punk rock background and just hardcore, you know, I was a big Under Oath person. I mean, still am, but you know, I was into all that stuff and just the middle finger to culture vibe that I found in evangelicalism, oddly enough, looking back on it. But there is something I think that is punk rock about just talking about these things in very like, you know, hardcore ways of just dying to self and picking up your cross. And there's something really subversive about loving one's enemy as oneself. Like that's a counterculture idea, period, right? And I think where I struggle, you know, just to kind of get into maybe some of the weeds here on maybe where we might think about this differently, is I have completely shifted my view. I'm not sure where you land on this. Honestly, I'm gonna say where I am. I really shifted my view from a non-queer affirming to a fully inclusive position, both theologically and culturally. And that was not overnight. It was a long journey. But just between how I understood the Bible and having the privilege of interviewing amazing biblical scholars, and just hearing different ways of how we understand sexuality compared to the biblical world, etc. I got to a point where I said, you know, I can't justify having an ethic for my queer neighbor that says, look, the only option for you is to stay celibate because that's your burden to carry. But, you know, hey, as a heterosexual man, sex is on the table and so is companionship because I'm straight if I just do it the right way. And I eventually kind of came full circle on that and said, I don't think it's sinful at all. In fact, I want to promote that between my queer neighbor for the sake of their own flourishing. I know that in some spaces I've encountered, and I don't know if you know the Bible Project, but they're kind of notorious for this. I love Tim Mackey. I love John Collins. They have helped me so much understanding the Bible, but they're kind of like, I think, intentionally silent on some of these other issues. And I think that for a lot of people who want to stay rooted in the way of Jesus, but also are thinking about those questions and landing differently, they're wondering, you know, maybe how folks like yourself think about that, right? I mean, it's a huge issue right now. It's a huge conversation. And I think that for me, I find the side B option, maybe like the Preston Sprinkle option, if you know who Preston is, and he's been on the show before. I just find that view untenable long-term on a host of different like levels, not just one or two. So I'm kind of curious for you how you think about issues like that I think are more quote unquote divisive in the church.
Well, I mean, I'm sure it probably doesn't come as any surprise to anyone who's read anything that I've written or has heard sermons from I don't know. It's like, I'm not assuming anyone's reading me, you know, or anything like that. But I think that part of me shirking the shackles of my upbringing, or at least in an attempt to at first immaturely jettison just about everything that I was given in my theological upbringing, I came to a place where I think almost everything was up for grabs. Sounds really lazy, but I mean, I was flexible or open to any other perspective other than the one that I was taught, which is obviously not a great or mature way to approach, you know, forming a theological paradigm. But it did put me in a place where I was at least willing to hear from, entertain any and all theological perspectives outside of my own. I think that maybe I had come to a place where the only thing I knew for sure was that I did want to follow Jesus, whatever in the world that means. Right. But how one understands the scriptures and even like huge historic paradigms for things like the authority of the Bible, heaven and hell and salvation, all these things are completely, in at least there was a period when I was like, I don't know what I think, and I'd like to know what I think, you know, and
100%.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that like, oh, okay, so that puts me in a place to like make the best, most informed decisions, but I guess it does at least put me in a place where I was able to afford myself a 180 from anything that I'd been taught if I felt so inclined.
Yeah.
So my kind of like doorway back into like a historic and orthodox position in almost everything theological is was through the scriptures at first, like and that's my, I did the whole like seminary and all that stuff. And I intentionally chose a seminary that had like almost all Reformed professors, because I am not Reformed, and that had more conservative views than I had at the time, or maybe even that like you would call even now. Because I didn't want to go to a place where everyone's going to tell me exactly what I think I want to hear, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I was writing essays to my Calvinist professors on, exactly why their perspectives are so wrong, these old PhDs. And I'm like, 21 years old and being like, oh, I figured it all out. And it put me in, I guess, an environment with other Christians who were all over the map as well. And like turning around to someone next to me and like, oh, why in the world do you think this completely different thing than I do about hell or about the nature of providence? And, but I did land in a place eventually and over time where I take like a historic Orthodox position on things like heaven, hell, the Bible, the church, sexuality, gender, across the map. So my perspective is similar to someone as like Preston's, though Preston's a Reformed guy. I'm not a Reformed guy. And a lot of that kind of shook out in relationships as well as a pastor. One of my closest friends is a pastor who's, in his language, not mine, but he would use the term same-sex attracted, and who embraces a lifestyle of what he would describe as chastity. How's that for a terminology? Yeah.
Man, really going old school here.
I know, no kidding. Not even celibacy, but chastity, like with the belt and everything. No, and a whole, I guess, group of folks that are within my church community who are without any, who came into our community as people who are, gay or identify as queer, and who are embodying a lifestyle that they believe is consistent with the way of Jesus, that includes something like celibacy or chastity. And then, of course, I know and am interacting on a semi-regular basis with people who completely disagree with my position or take a side A, side B, or something in between. I think that for me, one of the things that I guess delineates, or not makes, I don't mean to say that like in some ways it's like you throw a rock and hit somebody who has the same perspective of me. There's the opposite perspective of me. There's nothing like beautifully unique about my approach to anything. But I think that where my upbringing affected me in such a way that is pastorally practical is, I think that, I don't have any illusions about the church's mistakes or the terrible approach that the church has taken, especially Western and American evangelicalism has taken toward conversations around what it means to be a sexually formed human being as a disciple of Jesus. And I think that I don't have much interest in, or I don't have any interest actually in enforcing my perspectives on things like sexuality or gender in the political or public square whatsoever. What I have interest in personally is in the vulnerability and accountability of community. And so when someone who's a brother or sister in Christ, so to speak, or a Christian who is of their own volition participating in the community of like my church, for example, then everyone is calling one another to a kind of shared accountability and vulnerability that looks like becoming, among other things, more consistent with the character of Jesus and, I guess, obedient to the teachings of Jesus and the scriptures as we see them from our historic, Orthodox position. But I think that the paradigm that I assumed when I was in my more transient theological phase was, well, it's either the conservative kind of fundamentalist worldview that I was handed, which was very hostile and hateful and theologically bankrupt, or it's like this completely, or maybe a characterization of the progressive view from the conservative camp, which is like no kind of sexual ethic whatsoever, however one might lazily characterize that kind of thing.
Sure, sure.
Rather than a wealth of tradition in between those two that makes room for conversation and nuance and an evolution of perspective, whether one embraces like what I would call a historic position or what someone else might call a progressive position, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and it's definitely helpful, and I appreciate you adding the caveat that this is not about like what you're advocating for politically or for your neighbors who would not hold to some kind of Christian identity, especially in your local church. And that's, I think a lot of people, like, again, we're talking about things that get lumped into one or two categories, right? Either you are non-affirming and you're trying to fight against the rights of your queer neighbor politically because you're a good Christian, or you're the other way where you're fully affirming and therefore it comes with these political views. And then what I hear you saying is kind of like, actually, they're kind of separate for me, meaning like how I think about the church I'm pastoring and what we've agreed upon is one thing. How we think about this stuff on a national level, policy-wise, is another thing, and that is helpful. I just so the audience knows, I talked to you about this before we started recording, so this is not like nothing I'm saying here is a gotcha question. It's not clickbait for some kind of reel that I got Josh into a corner, because that is not the approach here. I think that. I'm asking really out of curiosity. I really am curious because it's not super often I talk to someone with your perspective on things who is kind of hard to pin down, right, in one way or another. And I appreciate that. It makes it fun and it makes it compelling. And it reminds me that people are complicated and it's not that people don't fall into binaries. Because you mentioned, and I'm saying this because I hear the same language echoed with other people. So I'm not just saying that this is because you're saying it. But I hear that term a lot, historic, orthodox. And I would love your thoughts because, and I did not go to seminary, so don't misunderstand. I am not educated on that level. But I have found that by being in conversation with some of these biblical scholars, those terms, again, seem to die the death of a thousand qualifications. For example, right, heaven and hell. This is a fun one, I think. Heaven and hell there really is, in my opinion, no orthodox position about heaven and hell, because depending on when you were born and what church tradition, with what church father or theologian teaching you, you might land on eternal conscious torment. You might be taught that universal reconciliation is the option. Maybe it's annihilationism, like Preston Sprinkle, and I've heard even Tim Mackey propose. And frankly, I tend to land there, I think, more than out of the three. But that's as orthodox, I guess, as eternal conscious torment, right? So I ask that because when you use that language, and I know that you understand the complicated nature of the Christian tradition, do you think that there is room for people who would who would hold an affirming position to be part of that, sense of Christian or historic Christianity, given just how, even with sex and sexuality, even marriage, why we get married, different reasons depending on different times. Martin Luther, right, said famously that birth control is worse than incest. Most Protestant evangelicals today don't think twice about using birth control, right? They just don't care what Luther had to say about it for whatever reason. So I'm just curious for you, do you see this as like, hey man, like there are people who are going to see this differently, and we make room for that? Or are you more in the camp of like, look, there's only one way, and if not, I really question your allegiance, we can say, or even salvation. I'm again, not a gotcha question. I'm just really curious to hear it from your perspective.
Yeah, totally. Well, first of all, for the answer to this question, look for my upcoming book, Birth Control is Worse Than Incest.
Yeah, you want a provocative title. There you go. I'll have you back on for that one too.
No.
That's funny.
I guess to that, I'd say a couple things. One is that the short answer, just to alleviate some of the tension maybe a listener might be feeling from it, is, of course, there's a tremendous amount of room for wrestling through exactly what qualifies as quote unquote orthodox. This is a word that means like right belief. And that has been important to Christians for 2,000 years, the idea of right belief. Without right belief, there's no religious worldview, period. There's no worldview, period. So obviously orthodoxy means something, and it has to mean something and not mean something else. And I don't think personally, and this has been very important to me as like a pastor and a writer and a Christian in general, I think it's important that orthodoxy does mean something and not something else. That said, you make an excellent example right there. Even things that are deeply precious to certain swaths of the Christian movement, especially modern Christians, like a very clear and in some cases black and white paradigm for, say, heaven and hell, have been open to several different positions throughout, church history, and wildly different. Like I also am someone who holds to like a conditional immortality or annihilationist perspective on hell, for example. And that across church history has not been that controversial a perspective, but in kind of modern mainline American Christianity, it's a deeply controversial perspective. But so is a position like nonviolence. Nonviolence was taken for granted for the first few hundred years of church history.
It's like now one of the few things, right? They all agreed on. They're like nonviolence.
Yes, uniformly, right. And not just in philosophy, but in practice. Christians refuse to participate in the state, refuse to go to war for or against the state.
Military,
and now to say that is like, to the kind of obviously to the Christian nationalists, but to a certain like group of Christians in America is a deeply controversial perspective. And in some cases, because they don't know. I wasn't taught that was the unanimous position of the church for several hundred years, So obviously there is a tremendous amount of room within Orthodoxy for nuance and interpretation and debate and the evolution of perspective. I like to think of, and I've written about this before, but I like to think of Orthodoxy as kind of like a wide countryside, but it does have some kind of limitations. You know what I mean? So when it works well, I think that certainly there are camps within Orthodoxy, and that's how you get Catholicism and Protestantism. That's how you get Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. And that's how you end up with the Calvinists and the Arminian, on and on and on. And I see all of them as Christians, even though our differences in theological perspective have literally divided us in practice, because I'm a Protestant pastor. I don't go to a Catholic church personally or pastor. I'm not a Catholic priest, but I also spend an entire day every single month at a monastery where I go to afternoon prayer with the monks and everything. And I'm trying to hide so I don't get kicked out, because I don't bow to Mary on my way out of the...
Right.
So, like in that sense, my position on the rigidity of Orthodoxy has certainly softened over the years. And I think within that, one of the most important aspects of Orthodoxy throughout church history has been that there has been room to ask the questions that you're asking, even when it comes to deeply divisive or controversial issues, and maybe even especially so. Not just heaven, hell, and salvation, but of course, sexuality, gender, these kinds of things. I think that maybe the comfortability I have in taking a position has also grown out of my comfortability with the possibility of being wrong and the possibility of entertaining perspectives outside of my own. So I think that, again, many years ago, I was never really that militant about this particular issue, but I was certainly deeply militant about, say, something like Calvinism versus a free will theism. To the degree that I would challenge the idea that, like, man, if you think that God determines the abuse of children, is that even a Christian perspective? Because, again, provocateur, I like to argue, but also was very rigid in my ideas of what does and doesn't qualify as scripturally consistent. I think that I'm at a place now where I'm able to make peace with, like, you know what, this is what I think about this or that issue theologically. This is where I think the bounds of Orthodoxy do and don't exist. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. And I'm happy to sit with and have conversations with other people. I don't feel any kind of militant thing about them one way or the other. I am willing to passionately debate with people in my lives with whom I have relational equity.
For sure.
I don't have any desire to, like, campaign around or against these things. So
you don't want to start a YouTube channel and just start going ham on topics?
I don't know that anyone wants to see. Nobody wants to see me on YouTube, And no, I think honestly, having the perspective that I have is like, it's also fine with me that people disagree with. Like, if you pick up a copy of How to Die, or certainly if you pick up a copy of Death to Deconstruction, and you hate it and you hate everything in it, or you hate some of it and like some of it, that's fine. That's fine. With, even when I was a teenager listening to like Antichrist Superstar by Marilyn Manson as a Christian, a Christian teenager in a youth group, I figured, oh, okay, like, well, I don't agree with all that. I kind of agree with some of that, and it sounds cool. And then that was fine. I went around so I try to entrust my output to other thinking adults with that same jurisdiction. That's like, agree, disagree. I'm happy to have conversations. I don't feel militant about them, and I'm happy to include the conversation within the bounds of orthodoxy, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I hated your old book so much that I burned it in active defiance. So you want provocative, like, there you go. No, I'm just kidding.
No, you went to you went to like one of those acquire the fire retreats.
Yes,
and
exactly. You threw I threw it right in there. Yeah, look, I this is where you and I think strongly find a lot of overlap, and I think the audience does too. The best way I describe it to people is I've been a musician now for 20 something plus years. I just stopped playing professionally a couple months ago. And one thing I learned as a drummer was that the more I played and the more I thought I knew, the more I realized how little I actually knew about my instrument, right? Like it's a weird paradox where the more you know, the more skilled you are, the more you're like, dude, there's so much out there that can be done on the drums I'm not even scratching the surface of. And I think that's kind of what happened, essentially, to both of us as we kind of got out of the basement of fundamentalism. We kind of realized, like, wow, this is a really big, complicated world of Christian thought that has tons of rooms in it. And I'm never going to be able to figure out the, like, singular meaning of the true version of the Christian faith. Because I was kind of given that as a Calvinist. I was taught that, like, hey, the people speaking in tongues are probably demonic, and God has predetermined all things that shall come to pass. And I also learned, and I know we're almost out of time, but I realized that kind of one of the, I think, fatal flaws in like the modern apologetics industry, right, of like trying to evidence demands a verdict kind of way of thinking, is that theology and these conversations in a lot of ways is like a conversation on art. Like we're just doing our best to make sense of things that we weren't around for. The Bible that we have, which I hold as authoritative in my life, is a complicated collection of texts, and how we got it's even more complicated. And it's complicated, and we're doing our best to have like educated guesses on like what we think happened and how it all worked, but we just don't know because it's not science, right? Like we're not measuring, the circumference of the earth, or we're not putting together a puzzle. It's a complicated thing, and then you add on culture and history and different traditions and their church fathers, and before you know it, you're like, wow, we got three major schisms with their own universes inside of them that we'll never be able to fully explore. And so there's a kind of humility I have found over time where, do I love sitting around a campfire and debating friends on theology? I do. I really do. Like I enjoy getting in the weeds. It's fun. But me 10 years ago would see it almost as like life and death. Like, well, if you're not convinced of my position, you're just straight up wrong. And now I see it almost as like sparring, right? Where it's like, this is fun, this is great, but ultimately it doesn't really change the red letters that I hold authoritative in particular when it comes to, the Sermon on the Mount and how I'm supposed to live my life. And I think that has given me a sense of flexibility, maybe more than some would agree with, but I'm just kind of, I don't know, man, like, culture does impact how you understand your religious ideas. Like it just does. We're swimming in something that has tainted how we see the Christian faith that we're a part of, right? And I think that being aware of that is a good step, because at least in my tradition, I was given the opposite of like, no, we're just Bible believing Christians. Like, no, culture doesn't affect us at all, as we're like pledging allegiance to empire. You know what I mean? So anyway, I'm a little long-winded here, but all I have to say, I really agree with that posture of like, look, this is complicated stuff, and we're going to have people that aren't going to agree on things. But I do think that what we can agree on is that, and if we don't, this is fine too, but I kind of think about the call of the Christian is to obviously follow Jesus. What that looks like is giving people what heaven on earth can look like, right? Like I love this idea. I think I got it from the Bible Project of, humans have the option to create heaven on earth or hell on earth. Like, and we can be agents of chaos, or we could be agents of like peace and order and goodness. And that belief has really stuck with me as far as like how I think about living as an embodied Christian today. And that has shaped so much of the work that I do, whether it's with the New Evangelicals or it's what I do in my personal life. This idea of like, I want to be part of bringing heaven to earth. I don't want to be complicit in bringing hell on earth to my neighbors. And I think that's, for me at least, a good baseline of where we can start from. And if we're on that same page, then we can reason together and wrestle through the implications of that. But I think if we can get there, that's like a good, dare I even say, universal perspective to start on with how we kind of move forward as Christians in America.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that the baseline of loving God and loving other people, as reductive as it sounds, was good enough for Jesus. And
right.
It's funny the way that I guess spiritual formation moves us back to the simplicity of that paradigm when we allow it to do what it's supposed to do. Yeah. Meaning that I think maybe, and not just like my knowledge and wisdom and experience, but the time-tested knowledge and wisdom experience of saints and sages and mothers and fathers of church history have argued that the more that we become formed and made over into the image of Christ, the more that we, synchronize with the heart of God, the more that those two concerns, to love God and love other people, become the baseline for the human experience. And that when we deviate from those things, we move toward rigidity and hell on earth rather than heaven on earth. So yeah, I agree. But I hope that we're getting better at it.
Yeah, you and I both. Well, listen, friends, the book is How to Die, Chaos, Mortality, and the Scandal of Christian Discipleship. It's out now. You can buy it wherever books are sold. Josh, truly, it's always a pleasure talking to you. You're welcome back on the show anytime. If we were neighbors, I would drink coffee or beer. I don't really drink beer, but I drink a lot of coffee, and we can smoke. If we even, I don't know if you smoke, but I smoke Black & Mild sometimes. Around a campfire, we could debate all this stuff. But for real, it is good talking to you as always. If folks want to follow you, I know you're not the biggest social media person, but do you have a website or social media presence that people can find you on?
Yep. Everything's at joshuasporter.com. Social media, the whole thing. I'm in the world, not of it. You know what I'm saying?
I love it, man. Well, again, thanks for making time. It means a lot. And we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, dude.